G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. So jumping right into it, this is an advanced rigging tutorial on how to make a ball rig in Maya. So just starting out with a simple sphere, we're going to scale it up. And I'm going to use absolute units for this one. So when I say absolute units, no 0.5, 0.3 or anything like that. I'm going to go by a factor of 5, I think, in this case. And that will create a sphere that's around 10 units in height. So from top to bottom, approximately around 10 centimeters in height. Okay, so now holding X on the keyboard, so we get grid snapping. We're going to snap that ball so the base of the ball sits perfectly on the ground plane, so to speak, of the world. Okay, so now go ahead and freeze transforms and delete your history. All good. Now to aid us in visualizing what we're going to do with the deformations of this ball, we're going to add a quick material, just use a standard shader. And then on top of that, I'm going to add a texture to this, go to the color tab and add a checker texture. Nothing fancy, that will do. Then turn on texture preview to see what's going on in this viewport and we're good to go. Okay, so you may be surprised to hear that we're going to jump straight into making some squash and stretch work in the ball. So using deformers, we're going to create what is essentially going to be the ability to create really cartoony, fun animation through squash and stretch. And we're going to do that with a lattice. So just select the ball and then add a lattice. So go into the options tab. We want to make sure that it's going to be a pretty simple lattice. So set it to 2, 2, 2. On all settings, so we just have a basic square lattice with no subdivisions. And straight away, give it a test and see how the magic works. It's really cool. So once we go ahead and name the ball, make sure you start naming stuff right now, by the way. Anything that's geo, prefix it with geo. Anything else with rigs and controls, we'll name it as is. But just go ahead and click on the lattice and go to the control points, lattice points, and try deforming the ball. And you can see we're getting squash and stretch working straight off the bat. And this is the fundamental part of what makes this ball rig awesome and also what makes this ball rig work. Now you may notice that the ball itself has squash and stretch, but it doesn't have volume preservation. So we're gonna have to solve for that in the future, but for the time being, this will get us halfway there with some very simple controls. Now the first challenge we need to solve is basically being able to control the lattice points without actually having to control them directly. So we do that by creating what is called a cluster. So go ahead and select the first top 4 points of our lattice cube and then go over to deform and select cluster. So what we're effectively doing here is creating a control point that saves our selection as basically something that we can control without having to select all the different points. And if we click on that cluster, it's represented by a little C, we can effectively control those lattice points without actually having to interact with them directly. So go ahead and do the same thing for the bottom half of that cube and select cluster. And now we have complete control over our lattice points, which is just what we need to get our squash and stretch working. So now this still isn't perfect for animation control. So what we need to do is create some actual control curves that we use to drive the cluster. I'm going to create a custom control by using the EP curve tool. Just go to your curves and surfaces tab, double click on the option tab and set it to 1 linear. Now with that tool activated, I'm going to hold down the X key on my keyboard to snap to the grid and basically create an arrow to indicate which direction I want to create the squash and stretch to occur. Now, this control shape can be anything you want it to be. As long as it's clear to indicate the function of the actual control, that's all that really matters. But in this case, a simple arrow is enough to sort of show off exactly what the function of this thing is, which is basically to move the ball up and down on the bottom and top of the control. Okay, with that complete, we need to reset the pivot point of that control. So I'm going to select the object, push D on my keyboard to bring the pivot options, and then recenter that pivot point to the bottom of the arrow. I'm also going to rotate the control to align to the world space of my ball rig. So in this case, Y is up, X is sideways, and Z is forward backwards. Now position that arrow right at the top of our ball. Now, you can use snapping again to get it perfectly aligned. That's what I recommend. Get it right in center to that ball at the top. Now you can see my pivot point is still in the center of that object. So I really want to make sure that that pivot point is directly on the point where the cluster is sitting. I'm also scaling that control to sort of look more proportionate to the rig itself. But again, this is completely aesthetic to my taste, but to your taste, you may want to try something different. It's up to you. All that really matters is that that pivot point is in the right spot and everything has been frozen out. Okay, so again, just making sure that that pivot point is perfectly aligned to that cluster. Okay, so just go ahead and duplicate that now, because we need to have a second control for the bottom of the ball. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate that, freeze the transforms for both of those for now. And then we're going to grab that second control or second control curve, rotate that 180 degrees, and then position it at the bottom of the ball. Again, holding down X to snap along the grid helps immensely. Once you've done that, be sure to freeze the transforms yet again. Always freeze transforms on those damn controls, please. For my sake as a teacher and as an animator, freeze those transforms. Alright, sweet. So we got those two controls ready to roll. So now all we need to do is parent the clusters to the controls and we should be good to go. But before that, we need to make sure that we're naming everything correctly. So go ahead and name the top control as control, or with the prefix control, squash top. And then the bottom one with control, squash bottom. Okay, so now it's probably a good time to also lock away the geometry from being clicked on. So just go ahead and add that geometry to its own layer inside the display tab under the channel box at the bottom of the screen in the right hand corner. That will just allow us to lock it off so we don't constantly misclick the damn thing as we're trying to rig it. Set that layer to reference and then we're good to go. Okay, so the next stage is to control the clusters through our custom controls. So just go ahead and put the clusters in their corresponding parent control. So I'm going to put the first cluster in the top control and the bottom cluster in the bottom control by holding down the middle mouse button and dragging it to that area. And now we can control the cluster directly with our proper honest to God controllers. So now that is perfect for what we need, and we get complete control in terms of rotation, squash, stretch, and everything else in between. Okay, so this is where we run into our first little puzzle. As you can see, the squash and stretch is working, but it's not preserving the volume of that ball as we try to squash and stretch it like you would expect in reality. So what we're going to do is correct this by using the node editor and a little bit of very simple maths using a multiply divide node. But first we need to actually figure out what we're going to multiply or divide in order to get the squash and stretch to work properly. And we're going to do that by using what is called the distance tool. Now you can find this tool under the Create tab under Measure Tools, and then go down to the Distance tool. Or if you're having trouble finding it, you can always go to the Help tab and open up the search bar and type in Distance tool and you'll find it there. So the Distance tool effectively works like a live ruler, which will constantly calculate the distance between two objects, no matter how far or how close they are or how they're being manipulated. And the way to do that is that you just create these 2 points, make sure you got snapping turned on, and it will create this live ruler. Now, as you can see, it's created 2 locators automatically. And if I were to try and manipulate those, it would automatically calculate the distance. And you can see it in the viewport with this value of 10. So I've snapped it to the top and bottom of my ball on the side view. And as you can see, the height of the ball is 10 and so is the measurement. So I'm just going to move those locators into place in the middle of the ball, holding down snapping and making sure that they are good to go. And then go ahead and rename those locators appropriately. So the top locator will be called locator, in my case, locator squash top. And then the one on the bottom will be called locator squash bottom. Now, each locator needs to be a child of their respective controllers. So the locator for squash top will be under the control squash top controller, and the locator for squash bottom will be under the control squash bottom controller. Okay, once that's done, give it a test and you will see that the measurement will change as you manipulate your controllers. So as it gets longer, the value gets higher. As the 2 points get closer and closer together, the value drops. And of course, this happens to be the exact value we need to be able to get accurate squash and stretch to work within our ball rig. Okay, so a little bit of quick maths before we move on. In order to get relatively realistic squash and stretch to work, or volume preservation to work, we need to input a calculation. And that calculation is 1 over the square root of x. And in our case, we are going to apply that calculation to both the x and z coordinates of our scale attribute inside of our ball rig, or more specifically, the clusters that are driving the lattice deformation. All right, so don't freak out here. The node editor isn't as scary as you may think, but once you get used to it, it's an absolute lifesaver. This is one of the reasons why Maya is still the king of rigging. Nothing compares to it. It's basically because of this tool. The node editor is awesome. Okay, so we need to bring in a few of our objects into the node editor to be able to link them up together. So what you will need is the distance dimension node. You'll need our controllers, and you'll need the cluster handles as well. Go ahead and plot them to the node editor by clicking Add Selected Objects to Graph. That's that little button with the slidey rectangles. Now feel free to label that little tab as well, because you can have multiple tabs with different node setups as well. That's a good way of organizing the more complex rigs you may do in the future. I'm going to call this squash and stretch. Okay, so the first input we'll need is the distance dimension node. So that's the thing that's calculating the distance between the two locators. So that's what we're going to use first and foremost to calculate the squash and stretch. So grab that and move it to the left a little bit, because we're going to work kind of left to right along the graph just to make things a little bit clearer. Now the node setup works very simply. Anything on the left side of a node is your inputs. Anything on the right side of a node is the outputs. So anything that gets fed into it can be spat out on the right side. Now, if you want to visualize these inputs and outputs, you can actually click a button to see them all working together. So if you click on the view inputs and outputs on any given node, there's a little button in the top left corner for that in the window. You can see the inputs and outputs for that. We'll need that in this case for the dimension node. Now, as you can see, it's taking information from the locators to calculate that distance operator, which is just what we need. Now that value has to be put into our two cluster nodes, which is controlling the shape and size of our lattice. So remember back to the start of the video, we were able to control the lattice through those clusters. They are the things that are manipulating the cluster directly. So we need to grab the cluster handle nodes. So I'm accidentally clicking the wrong ones here. These aren't the ones we need. We need the cluster handle nodes, not the shape node, the cluster handle node. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, it's the only way to get this across. And as you can see, if I do a little test, if I click on the cluster directly, you can see I have the cluster handle selected as a group. There it is there, the cluster handles, label and everything. If I were to scale that, you can see it's manipulating the ball directly. So that's exactly what we need to be manipulating in our calculation. So let's jump back straight into the node editor and find those two little nodes and then hook this whole thing up. Okay, so grabbing those cluster handle nodes. There's the first one, grab that one. And the other one is on the left side of my screen in my case. So I'm going to rearrange things a little bit, have a look around and see what's going on. So I'm going to put those aside for now, the shape nodes, and grab the two handles. Those are the ones we need. And I'm just going to set it up in a way that I can see everything. So clicking on those three little buttons, the little hamburger menus, will expand the attributes available to us in that node. What we need is the scale attributes for X and Z. We'll get to those in a second, but let's set up our multiply divide node so we can pump out the calculation we need to get the squash and stretch to work properly. Okay, to bring up the multiply divide node that we need, click tab on the keyboard and type in multiply divide, and it will come up as a bolded option. Click on that and it will create the node that we need. Expand that by clicking on the hamburger menu a few times, and you'll see that we have two inputs. One is for our 1/x attribute, and one will be our actual distance attribute from the distance dimension node. All we need from this node is the distance output. Okay, so this is where taking note of what you're doing is really, really important. We need to know what the scale is of our ball to begin with in real world terms. So if you remember, we created our ball with a factor of 5, which turns out to be essentially a value of 10 overall in terms of height. So we need to switch our attribute to divide and put in our import ones across our x, y, and z. Across all of those values, we have to put a value of 10. That is the total height of our ball. Okay, so remember, 1 over the square root of x is what we're going to be working with. So essentially what we're doing is dividing against the total amounts here. Now, in the distance attribute, we're going to plug in the distance into the input 2x, 2y, and 2z of the multiply divide node. And what that will do is essentially give us exactly that, 1 over the square root of x. Now, we're going to shit out that value into our x and z attributes of our squash and stretch handles. So grabbing those handle nodes, you can see the scale attribute there with a little plus icon. If you click on the plus icon next to the scale, you can expand your x, y, and z attributes. So just go ahead and click on the cluster squash top handles, open up the scale x, y, z on both of those. Cool. And then the output x goes into the input scale x in both of those nodes. And then the output z goes into the input scale z in both of those nodes. We are ignoring y because y isn't being affected by the squash and stretch. We're already getting that stretch in the y value, so we don't need to cancel that out. We only need that in the scale z and x. And as you can see, we get a way, way, way better squash and stretch attribute now in our ball rig. Now the squash and stretch is completely done, ready to roll. So for the most part, now it's really about building up hierarchies so we can get the control of the ball working throughout of our rig. Now just to see how it looks with the textured view, you can see the squash and stretch will actually affect the textures as well. It's affecting everything. And the cool thing about this is that it actually works with rotation as well. So you can get really squishy, sandbaggy like effects as well, which is really kind of cool if you wanted to do like a sandbag style animation, which is, you know, something to think about. But yeah, super cool stuff. Let's move on to creating the rest of the controls. Okay, for the rest of the controls, you'll need the following. You will need a global control. So basically a control master that will control the entire rig, including the squash and stretch controls, including the rotation controls and everything else. And we're going to call that the control master. And that control is going to be at the base of the ball. The purpose of this control is to set the ball in a scene where it needs to be and establish the scale of the ball as well. That's it. The next control to worry about is the center of gravity control, or the COG, or the cog. This control essentially acts like a master to the rest of the rig. This is where you can do the blocking out of your bounces, where you place the ball in vertical, horizontal space, and if you want to, you can still control the whole rig rotationally as well if you wish. Scale, on the other hand, is not an attribute that you have to worry about with this part of the control. The final two controls will essentially drive the rotation of the ball independently from the squash and stretch, and then the other control will control the rotation and direction of the squash and stretch where you need it to be. And that essentially will make up the rest of the rig in this video. Once you're happy with the control shapes you have, go ahead and make sure all the pivot points are where they need to be and that you've frozen the transform. So basically all the pivot points for all of the controls at the center of the ball should be at the center of the ball. The only control that needs to be at the bottom of the ball is the global control. Okay, once you've got all of that organized and set up, it's time to name your controllers. I can't stress this enough. You need to name your shit as soon as you get it done. All right, so we have our master control at the base, followed by the COG. So that's my center of gravity. And as you can see, I've shaped it sort of like a set of arrows that go in each direction, followed by a squash and stretch parent control. So you can name it as you wish, but basically that will be the parent of our two arrows on the top and bottom of our rig that will allow us to position the squash and stretch in any direction that we want, independently of the rotation of the ball itself. Finally, we have the control for the ball, and the ball, in similar fashion to the squash and stretch, should work independently from the squash and stretch outright. So that will give us 100% more flexibility as to how you want to operate with this ball. All right, cool. Finally, we can give these controls some colors. So just pop over to the attribute editor, select the shape that you want, and then go down to drawing overrides, and you can give it any color you like. So I'm just going to give it a set of colors to make it distinctive as to what each controller does. So maybe make the arrows blue or yellow or red or whatever you want to call them. You can give them whatever color you want, as long as it makes sense to you. And of course, as long as it makes sense to the animator that's going to be using the rig, of course. So again, how you go about that, it's completely up to you. It's pure aesthetics at this point. But I will say that it is aesthetics that serve a purpose. So giving them colors helps to distinguish what each function of the rig does, and it makes it easier to point out where things are as well. So just keep that in mind. Not everything should just be a plain blue thing. Okay, so now it's time to start to work out our hierarchies. And as you can see, none of these controls are really doing anything just yet. We need to figure out what goes where. So go ahead and select the rotation, the squash stretch, the COG, and the controls for the squash bottom and squash top. Middle mouse drag them into the control master. And that will allow us to control the whole rig from the master control at this point. Move it around, give it a bit of rotation, all that sort of thing, and you'll see it works quite well. If you do a bit of scaling, you will see there might be an issue, but we'll get to that later. But anyway, as the control master, it's doing its thing, it's rotating correctly, it's moving correctly, it's bringing everything along for the ride, everything is working perfectly so far. As for the COG or other controls, they're absolutely useless right now, so we need to actually put in some connections to make this thing work. Some of these are going to be simpler than others. All right, the first one on that list is the squash and stretch parent. So right now it's not doing anything. It doesn't drive anything, and none of the squash and stretch controls follow with it. That's a simple solution. Just grab the controls for the squash and stretch top and bottom, middle mouse drag them, and put them underneath the squash parent. And now that's moving perfectly. The squash and stretch is moving along with the ball control. And if we try to squash and stretch as well with rotations in mind, that will work like magic. And as you can see, it's doing its thing, looking great, doing exactly what we need. All right, the last piece of the puzzle is basically the rotation of the ball itself. And this is where we're going to control the ball for the most part. This is what will drive any rotations for bouncers and stuff like that. Now, you may be thinking, let's just parent the ball to the rotation and that will just work. Or let's just parent the squash and stretch to the rotation. That's not what we want. We want to have independent control from the squash and stretch to be able to create as many variations of animation that we want from this rig. We also can't parent the ball mesh to the controller either because it's already being driven by the lattice, which is already a child of the controllers. See what I mean? So what you end up with is double transforms and everything will just break. What we can use, however, is constraints. And in this case, we're going to constrain the controller directly to the ball mesh. All right, so to do that, just go ahead in the outliner, select the ball rotation control, then control select the geo ball mesh. Then go to your constraints tab under the animation or rigging tab and open up the orient constraint with offsets, push add. And now that ball will be driven by that control. Now, here's what we got so far. We got squash and stretch that works independently from the rotation. We can still rotate that ball independently, which is awesome. We got independent rotation of the squash and stretch, so we can rotate that in any direction we want. So if you have a ball bouncing off a wall and it goes in an opposite direction, you can squash and stretch for that. And you can see the control for rotation of the ball drives the rotation of the ball in tandem with squash and stretch, so independently. Okay, the last relationship to have is the COG. You can see the COG ain't doing shit right now, and that one's a really simple solution. We just got to make the ball rotation control and the squash control be driven by the COG. Now, the squash parent is pretty straightforward. Just grab the squash parent and make it a child of the COG by middle mouse dragging it into the COG group. And now that's moving like a treat. Looks perfect, doing its thing. Chef's kiss. Now with the ball rotation control, however, we have to do something a little bit different, and we're going to use a point constraint to constrain that to the COG. Reason being is that if we add rotational attributes or make it a child, it will lead to the same problem with double transform. So we're just going to go ahead and select the COG, select the ball rotation control, go up to your constraints tab, and then select point constraint with maintain offset. And let's give it a go. So we have the global control. It's driving everything, doing everything we want it to do, rotating, moving, etc. The squash and stretch is squashing and stretching on both the top and bottom. We have rotational control for the squash and stretch. We have independent ball control from the squash and stretch. And then from the COG, we can control the location and rotation of the ball from the center of mass, which is absolutely perfect. But we have one last issue, and that is scale. Now, the scale from the COG should scale uniformly, but the ball is stretching as we scale our rig. Now, this is something that we can either ignore or we can fix. Now, depending on what you're planning on doing with your rig, you can either ignore it and just hide away the scale attribute and just, pretend it's not a problem, or you can go ahead and fix the problem, which we're going to do before we wrap this video up. And the solution, as you may have guessed it, lies in the node editor. Now, don't fret. It's a pretty simple solution. We're just going to add an extra multiply divide node in between our scale attribute for the squash and stretch. So just go ahead and open up the node editor. And if it looks like a giant mess, you can always relay out everything by pushing the relay out button. And we're just going to look for the COG, not the COG. We got to find the master control, the base control for our node. So grab that master control, bring it all the way to the start of our node chain. And we want to line it up with our distance node. The same node that we started with at the start. We have our multiply divide node there. We're going to expand the master. And we're going to work with the scale attribute here as well. So just expand it. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on a little bit easier. Add a brand new multiply divide node by tapping into the search parameter. Expand that out. And then expand out the inputs. Open up the attribute editor so we can see what's going on as well. I'm going to set that to divide. Okay, in a similar fashion, we're going to grab the outputs from the scale of the control master in this case. Open those up so we can see X, Y, and Z. Now, starting with the distance node, we're going to grab our distance attribute and hook it into the input 1x, 1y, and 1z attribute of the first layer input, so input 1. And then from the control master output, we're going to grab the scale y and put scale y into every input, 2x, 2y, and 2z. All right, cool. Now that output is going to be replacing the current output that we have from the distance node. So output x goes into input x, output y goes to input y, output z goes into input z. Now let's go ahead and give that a test. Grab that global control and scale it up. And it's working a absolute treat. Absolutely gorgeous. Now, there's only one issue with this whole rig, really, and that is that we do get a few multiplications on the transforms in rotation from the global control. But that's okay, because we have plenty of opportunity to rotate that ball with our other controllers. So now it's time to lock and hide every controller you can find that you don't need a control for. So in the case of the global control, lock off and hide the rotations. In the case of the COG, lock off and hide the scale. In the case of the 2 rotational controls, lock off and hide your location and scale. In the case of the stretch controls, lock off the scale. And that's it. That's all we need. Done and dusted. All right, let's give this a little whirl. And as you can see, everything is working at absolute treat. Squash and stretch, rotations, you name it. Everything is going great. We got location in the controllers here. We can move it anywhere we want. We can scale it any way we want. That's awesome. We can grab the global control, or the COG, sorry. We can rotate it any way we want. We can place it anywhere we want in space, up and down, side to side. We got our squash and stretch. We can squash and stretch, rotate the squash and stretch. We can squash and stretch in any direction we want. We can even rotate the squash and stretch. How cool is that? And of course, we can get the ball rotating just as you'd expect, independently of the squash and stretch as well. Everything you would need from a advanced ball rig without any fancy bullshit, ready to roll. If you like this video, if you enjoyed watching this, if you got something out of it, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share the video to as many people as you can. I could really use the help. I would appreciate it a lot. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you in the next one. Have fun. I'll see you later.